Here is not instruction. Here you got
Minutes late.
Hello, Mr. Goodrich.
You need a louder instrument.
No, ask me
Hammer
to speak.
would be the right thing.
Ask me to speak, and then it's all right.
Will the meeting come to order, please? Ladies and gentlemen, we are 10 minutes late and we have 5 speakers. So I urge each of the speakers to stick to the agreed time. But first, a 1 minute announcement by Dr. Hunold.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the excursion of this afternoon, for those who want to take the bus to the Cascades, the bus will leave here the Schloss Hotel at 3:15. But those who want to walk, it's about 30 minutes to walk, they have to leave at 2:30 before the hotel. And Miss Berg will be the mountain guide to go up to the Hercules. Second remark, I did a mistake this morning while sitting in the chair. There was and I must apologize, Mr. Veit wanted to intervene and I thought he wanted to speak and spoil the whole panel. This is not true. He only wanted to say that I may open a window. I apologize, not even this he could do. Afterwards I saw that the refrigerator, air conditioner was not put on. It is on now and everything is in order. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us start. We have 5 speakers. The first one is Professor Günther Schmölders from the University of Köln, Politicians and the Currency. He promised to stick to 25 minutes. Professor Schmölders.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, when the plan was drafted for the discussions about public opinion in a free society, Dr. Hunold wanted to include a few practical examples of public opinion molding and public opinion building. And so he chose my investigation about politicians and the currency as such an example. Now, you have seen my paper in the documents prepared by the preparing committee, and I think it's by far too long to discuss in detail here the paper, which I was informed by Dr. Hunold you have read altogether. Thank you. Instead of that, I shall try to give a very short resume of the findings we came to in our investigation. And our starting point was the fact that the currency today is not any longer something automatic, an automatical process as it used to be in the gold standard time. But instead of this automatism, this has been replaced by political manipulation of production of gold. Take, for instance, the Soviet Union. A production of gold which has completely gone out of the economic order and gone into the political order. And on the other hand, In the internal area of currencies, also here political reasons have developed and prevail over economic reasons. We have political orders like the one of full employment, the one of cheap money, and all this here are political reasons instead of real economic reasons behind the manipulations. And even in the international field, the rate of exchange today has been agreed upon in international agreements, like the agreements from 1936 or the agreements from Bretton Woods in 1944 and the latest agreement of 1958. The currency has become something political. The currency has been politicized, if this is an English expression for it. Now, the consequences of this fact seem to me to belong to our discussion today about public opinion in a free society. Because the consequence that the currency has been politicized is a certain danger for stability of currency. It's an imminent danger of inflation. All deficit spending of governments, all subsidies granted by governments and granted to lobbyists, and the lobbyists taking the budget in their hands and accumulating even more subsidies for one or the other purpose, and all wage and price relations, the wage price spiral, the thing named by Dr. Hahn yesterday, the cost push inflation and the demand pull inflation. All these forms of inflation have something to do with public opinion and something to do with the political bias of lobbyists and great the vested interests in the great organizations, trade unions, and so on. And now it must be very interesting to know if politicians are aware of these strong interrelations between government deficit spending and stability of the currency, between wage increasing and increasing faster than productivity increases and the stability of currency. And all these promises for the election day given in the form of subsidies by the government to the single great areas of political and economic interest and stability of the currency. Even the distinction between the creeping inflation and the galloping inflation, where is the threshold from the one to the other, all these questions must be in a certain way find their reactions in the minds of politicians or not. Are the politicians aware of these close interrelations? And if the politicians are aware of these economic facts and economic interdependencies, would they be inclined, would they be prepared to act respectively, to act correspondingly upon this knowledge of the interrelations? That means to make an investigation into the ways of thinking, the ways of reasoning of politicians, and to find out whether into their conception of politics our interrelations fit into these conceptions or not, and if they are, the politicians would be apt to make use of the knowledge if they have it. Is it the way of a politician to think and reason economically? That's the whole question boiled down into one single question. Now we have made such an investigation, which I think is the first one done in any country of the world, with the help of my little Institute for Empirical Economics Research in Cologne and the Allensbach Institute of Demoscopy, into the members of parliament in Germany, the members of the German Bundestag. The Bundestag has 500 members, and we had nearly 100 of them interviewed, each more than 1 hour, interviewed by the chief interviewers of this very experienced Institute of Demoscopy in Allensbach. And we put them a number of questions and we noted their answers, and they had not only to answer yes or no, but they were asked to give their comments. And in many instances, these comments were still more interesting and still more, I don't know the English expression for erschütternd, than the shaking, shocking and shaking, than the answers to the questionnaire. May I compile the results of the investigation in a very few examples. It was interesting to know how many of the lawmakers are informed about our economic interdependencies, about these economic questions of interrelation between government deficit spending and inflation and so on. And we tried to find out how many are informed in very simple questions about some very evident interrelations, and how many are informed about the more complex phenomena, and how many finally are informed about the very complex interrelations as we have experienced them in Germany in our so-called Julius Tower complex. You know that the German Federal Republic has accumulated for a number of years a big amount of billions of marks, finally nearly 7 billions of marks, and expended these billions of marks during the boom in 1958 and 1959 again. So it was a most tickling experience to ask our lawmakers if they had had any knowledge of this and any understanding of this process, and if they had any understanding of the interrelations which this spending of 7 billions additional marks during a boom would have on the price level, and all that, that here stability of the currency is impaired. Now first about very evident interrelations. Nearly a little more than 1/2 of our lawmakers react reasonably. We asked them if they were inclined to vote for more money to be spent for some very popular purposes. For instance, better streets, better schools, more research for universities and so on. And most of them were inclined to spend more money for these purposes. All in all, we had 76% who answered in the affirmative. 76% yes, for more money for some popular purposes. Now our next question naturally was, how do you think you can finance this more expenditure? And here we had two questions asked. Do you propose to introduce new taxation or to increase the existing taxation, or do you prefer to cut on other expenditures? And 51 of our respondents were for cutting other expenditures, and 24 were for other more taxation. Now, by implication, it would have been a very interesting question to see whether the lawmakers are aware of the fact if they are for cutting other expenditures, they are opposing their own views from a year or so before. Before it was them who voted for the existing budget and the existing and not more expenditures for this and that purpose. And they did something what I would call désavouieren. They distrusted themselves if they say we must cut expenditure. We did it. We did something wrong. But nobody had any feeling of that he is responsible for the other expenditure the amount of expenditures to be expended in the existing budget. And if he votes for cutting these, he makes something, he agrees he has made a mistake before. There was no such feeling among the parliamentarians at all. But all in all, we have 50 or 51% who gave reasonable answers on this very evident question: if you will expend more money, you must take it somewhere. Well, that was reacted upon by 51%, not more. It's not very much even here. But now the more complex phenomena. We asked them, how do you explain that there are in some countries inflationary trends and in others not? We gave them a list of countries and we gave them a list of possible reasons: the welfare state, too much expenditure by government, too high armaments cost, and so on, too high administration costs. And in this here respect, we didn't get 50%, we did only get 46% answers who can be classified as somewhat like reasonable reasons. I can't go into the details here, but you have a very extended report in the papers, so I can ask you to look into that. And even the whole thing is laid down in a book of mine, Die Politiker und die Währung, which is, I regret to say, written in German, but here you have an excerpt of it. Why got some countries inflation, others not? Only 46% of the lawmakers gave reasonable answers. And the next question was, do you think it would be possible to keep public expenditure on a reasonable level? Or is public expenditure bound to increase and increase and increase, to grow and grow and grow? And this was very interesting, that the lawmakers themselves, who make the laws, who make the budgets, said that only 40% of them held it for possible to keep the budget down on a reasonable level. But 44%, more than that, 44%, argued it wouldn't be possible to keep the budget down, to keep expenditure on a reasonable level. The budget expenditures were bound to increase and increase and increase. 44% of the men who vote for these expenditures, they could say that ourselves who are responsible for it. No feeling of that. They are apt to take it as a law of nature. Expenditures are going to grow, and there can nothing be done about it, not even by ourselves, the lawmakers. Our next group of questions was on the intricate problem of the Julius Tower. I told just now that there was an accumulation of big government surplus in the amount of nearly 7 billion of marks. And now we ask them, are there any reasons in your mind which would have forbidden the expenditure of this money, in the situation you have now? It was in June 1958, in the midst of the very impressive boom. Are there any reasons, as far as you know, who would hinder the expenditure now of this money? No, there are no such reasons. Only 16% found any reasons not to expend the money at this time. And when I asked the very bold question, which I had uttered in some public speeches, the best would have been to burn up this money, to take it out of circulation completely, burn it up, put it away, nothing more, to expend from government 7 billion in the middle of a boom. And we asked them in very cautious terms, what do you think of this idea of killing the money, burning it up in the midst of a big boom? Only 10% found any sort of reason in such a proposal. 90% say, no, that's an idea, just a theoretical and academical one of some mad professors. And now, the conclusion must be that in very evident questions of the day-to-day experience, can I expend money if I have none? There are about half of the lawmakers who have the insight that here are economical interrelations. I can't expend money which I have not. Only 51%. In more intricate, in more complex problems, like the problem of inflation here and no inflation there, and what are the reasons, and don't you think there are certain interrelations between the things? We have not fully half of the lawmakers coming into the idea giving reasonable answers. And in more intricate questions like the Julius Tower problem, the number of those members of parliament who have an insight and a knowledge of the interrelations dwindles down to 16% or 10%, and the whole interrelations, the best answer was only from one member of our parliament, and I have the doubt, I don't know the names, but I have the doubt it was one of our colleagues. We have some of our economists in the German Bundestag, and possibly they choose him out of the number of members of the parliament and put him the question. So this would be the answer of an economist and not the answer of a member of parliament. Now, the important thing we learn out of these investigations is how think and how react members of parliament, how react politicians on issues of economic interrelations. And the first answer we found is that politicians are very easily victimized by good slogans. If you had a good slogan, everything went well. Or they answered on the surface of a question, if it was put in a good terminology, in a good form of a good slogan, they found very soon the answer out of the general feeling about this slogan. In order to prove this, we put the questions in 2 or 3 different forms, in a very neutral form first, and then when we had the figures, the answers, we put the same question in another connection in the form of a slogan. And now we could count the difference between the answers on normal speech and speech in highly formulated, good formulated slogans. For instance, we asked them, what do you think about the present business situation? That was in June 1958, a very normal situation, no big boom, no big expansion imminent, and no depression or recession, nothing. We asked them, do you think it's normal? Well, we found the answer, 55% of the members of parliament answered normal. Then we put the question in another formulation. We asked them, what do you think about the coming business development? Is it going to grow? Haven't we today something like a wholesome breathing space? Oh, wholesome breathing space was a good slogan. We got not only 55 but 61%. More than the people who said it's normal, said it's a wholesome breathing space. We had other such slogans. The best one was contributed by the vice president of our German Bundesbank, who a few years ago, as a politician, had formulated the urge to expand the Julius Tower money into a very, very good formulation, which is in German, Kasse macht sinnlich. A very good slogan. In English, Miss Grossi-Schwager has translated cash makes sensuous. I propose to formulate cash tickles desire. Cash tickles desire among members of parliament. And this formulation was so good that the same people who answered the question in the affirmative, do you think a cash surplus can be kept from expenditure demands, was only 58%. But if we asked, have you heard cash tickles desire, and do you think that's true? They said not only 58 but 73% were aware, yes, cash tickles desire. So you see, the politicians are very reactive to slogans, to good formulations. They are very reactive to emotional, I can't give other examples here, but the emotional issues have a very good prospect to be realized even by lawmakers, and even little white lies are not unknown to them. We had inserted a few questions about what do you read, what do you consider as good literature, and we got some answers showing that some of them, 14% and 12% in some cases, insisted on titles which are completely out of date. One was from 1822 and the other was about Großherzogtum Baden, Finanzpolitik, fiscal policy in the Grand Duchess of Baden, which they certainly had not read, but they insisted on considering that a very good tool for fiscal policy. Even little white lies, strong emotional feelings, and a very great reaction on good slogans, victimized by good slogans. That's what our results were. And if so little information, now the question, how is the action? How are they acting? How are they behaving if they have so little knowledge and so little understanding of the interrelations? Well, you know how they have acted. Our German members know. They have expended the whole Julius-Tower money, not only for one purpose of 1 year, but they have given subsidies and they have enacted legislation fostering expenditures for the coming years as well. All of these 7 billion of marks, which we have had only once, but they expended it for permanent, partly for permanent purposes. So it is a very grave question. can't our lawmakers be made more, I won't say intelligent, we want have other members of parliaments. There will nowhere in no country there will be a better elite of lawmakers above the general meeting. And so I think it's not a question open to the education and re-education of lawmakers, but a question put to us economists. How can we find the way to fit our theories into the feelings and into the reactions of the politicians? How can we find so good slogans? How can we formulate our knowledge into such forms as to reach the level of understanding which we must take for granted? This level is there, and there's no other level to be hoped for. We must try to fit our knowledge and our experiences into this form of thinking, and if we can do that, we would do a good service for public opinion in a free society.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am in a very embarrassing situation. We are all in favor of demand and supply, but I'm in the strict instruction to bring the meeting to an end at 1 o'clock. That leaves 55 minutes, but the agreed minutes, that is the demand exceeds supply. What shall I do? Shall I ration the time? Let's first try to appeal to the speakers to cut down the time each by 10% of the agreed number of minutes. If that doesn't work, if the saline massage or whatever it is called doesn't work, then the last speaker will have to be put off until afternoon. Now, next speaker is Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn from Austria.
Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for reading my address, because if I talk freely, it'll take longer. In order to cut down the time, I'm going to read it to you. Alexis de Tocqueville, in the second volume of De la démocratie en Amérique, according to the author's own statement and essay on democracy rather than on the United States, wrote the following words. Je ne connais pas du pays où il règne en général moins de dépendance d'esprit et de véritable liberté de discussion qu'en Amérique. En Amérique, la majorité trace un cercle formidable autour de la pensée. L'Inquisition n'a jamais pu empêcher qu'il ne circulât en Espagne des livres contraires à la religion du plus grand nombre. L'empire de la majorité fait mieux aux États-Unis. Elle a ôté jusqu'à la pensée d'en publier. These remarks were made in the middle of the first century of the democratic revival, 50 years after the inception of the French Revolution. By that time, it was evident to several acute observers that an internal, truly teleological contradiction exists between democracy, a form of government, and the liberal principle, applicable to many domains. Between the combined postulates of civic equality and majority rule on one hand, and the insistence on personal freedom on the other. This insight was shared by the majority of America's founding fathers, by de Tocqueville, by Cooper, Proudhon, later by the great Swiss, Constant, Bachhofen, Amiel, Binet, Burckhardt, and finally, by so many of our contemporary genuine liberals. Naturally, we should not be surprised to find the freedom of speech in the private or public sphere severely curtailed by the ideologies representing the more radical branch of Jacobin democracy. Nobody expected that Danton, Robespierre, or Babeuf, who all owe so much of their political inspiration to Sade, the divine marquis, or that the Marxian socialists, the National Socialists, the Bolsheviki, after all the majority wing of those dear progressive social democrats in Russia, would tolerate freedom of thought, freedom of opinion. What interests us here primarily is the very subtle and, at the same time, profound crisis of intellectual freedom, which manifests itself today not only in the tyrannies of the East, and the newer ones in the South, of course, but in those democracies which honestly want to adhere to liberal principles. Here, however, we do not want to lose sight of the fact that in certain countries, this particular problem is being obscured, vitiated, and complicated by tragic historical events. Countries which went through the diabolic sieves of war, revolution, occupation, mass recrimination, and discrimination. Our men in the street, and even their betters, remind us so vividly of Mr. Golightly, Herr Leisetritt, in Hermann Borchardz's great conservative novel dealing with tyranny in its sordid aftermath, The Conspiracy of the Carpenters, New York, 1943. The fear to go on record, the horror for any real commitment, the timid clinging to officially sanctioned clichés certainly characterize large areas in free Europe where, within the last 40 years, the supporters of all imaginable ideologies have been subjected to indignities, to the curtailments of their rights, and to persecutions, if not to mass exile and mass murder. Therefore, it is not surprising that people adhering to ideologies frowned upon by liberal democracy even today still insist on being good Democrats or real Democrats, which sometimes means that, within certain mental reservations, they go on hoping to achieve their goals, some of a liberal, many of a highly illiberal nature, by the democratic procedures of majority decision and majority rule. Such talk in democracies is neither necessarily dishonest nor mere camouflage, as the democratic roots of our modern mass ideologies, all stressing some sort of identity, of sameness, Nämlichkeit, can hardly be contested. Tel est l'empire du mot démocratie que nul gouvernement, nulle parti n'ose vivre et ne le croit pouvoir sans inscrire ce mot sur son drapeau. Guizot wrote these words in 1849, but they are as true today as they were then. Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, Kwame Nkrumah, Mao Zedong, and Sékou Touré have all claimed to be true Democrats, but certainly not liberals. Thus, the crisis of the freedom of thought and speech manifest in the historic liberal democracies, no less in those of a more recent vintage, varies in its aspects and even in its nature, region by region. The average Austrian, for instance, who calls himself a Democrat, fluently talks democratese and in a way is a Democrat, who often makes sincere efforts to accept and assimilate the dogmas of democratism. Probably he's a man born under the monarchy who, like my humble self, went through 5 radically different forms of government, each forcing upon him new laws and ideologies, new flags and new hymns, new coins, new currencies, new stamps, new rather superficial loyalties and codes of behavior. He may be a Democrat partly out of sheer resignation, partly for material satisfaction, partly out of prudence, but he lacks the deep conviction of an American or of a Swiss, an Englishman or an Icelander, to whom democracy is much more than just a system of government. To a large number of continentals, however, their democracy is merely the product of a restoration engineered by a victorious military alliance, motivated by different reasons, an alliance which brought democracy back to deserted parliaments, just as the Bourbons were brought back to their thrones by another successful coalition 130 years earlier. We have talked about democracy, democratism, last but not least, because the new conformity, which certainly is not a strictly political phenomenon, receives its most pregnant expression in the political field. Of course, every absolutism is hostile to freedom of thought and expression, is propagating identity and attacking diversity. However, the freedom Western Europe enjoyed in the era of so-called royal absolutism, an era in many respects more liberal than our age of conscription, prohibition, confiscatory taxes, and social engineering, was due perhaps not so much to royal generosity than to a great number of local representative bodies counterbalancing the absolutism at the top. Yet absolutism always remains an evil, regardless of whether it has a royal or a democratic character. In this connection, we, nevertheless, are not permitted to forget that modern republican democracy is an absolutism, since it derives its authority solely from one source, majority will. We have abandoned the classic concept of the regimen mixtum. Thanks to the constitutional paralysis of the monarch, who at present is merely a psychological factor, it could rightly be said of the British Parliament that it now can do everything under the sun, except change a man into a woman or a woman into a man. Still, this does not answer our question why liberty of opinion and discussion, no less than originality of thought, have declined so tragically and perceptibly in our day and age. There was probably more liberty of spirit in the days when the fires of the Spanish Inquisition were blazing than in the middle-class republics of today. Nicholas Berdyaev lamented in Novoye Srednjovjekovje, the new Middle Ages. But there is a profound and tangible cause for this state of affairs. The late Harold Laski, in his Parliamentary Government in England, insisted that parliamentary democracy can only exist and survive if two conditions are met. A two-party system, and, more important still, B, a common framework of reference, a common ideological philosophical denominator, uniting these parties, which thus become, in American parlance, mere ins and outs. The situation has already been achieved in the English-speaking nations, from New Zealand to Britain, and it can also be said, without much danger of refutation, that while the two-party system is neither fully developed in Scandinavia nor in Switzerland, the bloc d'idées incontestable, the common framework of reference, there is well established. Democracy in these countries is conforming to the precepts of Laski, and thus is truly organic. This situation, however, could only be achieved due to the conscious and far more so to the subconscious effort of a society, not of a state, which felt and still feels instinctively that its system of government would be doomed if the people were divided by real ideological differences. In other words, it is not the state which imposes a conformity of thinking, speaking, or printing, but the live, spontaneous forces of society which almost automatically silence and isolate the basic political nonconformist. Let us take America, for instance, where we see a society highly skilled in promoting the spirit of uniformity, having had the practical experience of assimilating millions and millions of immigrants who had to be cast into a new national and ideological mold. In the United States, every high school textbook, every presidential message, every radio address, every valedictorian speech, every bestseller, every radio play, every film, and every newspaper editorial, provided they deal with political fundamentals, will praise republicanism and democracy, democracy and republicanism. Thus, if we could stop a subway train in New York during the rush hours, line up all its strap-hanging human sardines, and ask them about their basic political views, we would find that 100% profess to be Republicans with a small r, and 999 out of 1,000 profess to believe in democratism. The lone dissenter, we might assume, has read the violently anti-democratic writings of America's founding fathers. In Madrid or Barcelona, however, making the same experiment, mutatis mutandis, we will discover a breathtaking variety of ideologies and unofficial allegiances. Liberal monarchists and monarchical absolutists supporting the various branches of the Bourbon dynasty. So-called Christian Democrats with or without Falangist affiliations. Republican Democrats and Democratic Socialists. Separatists and anarchists. Stalinists and Trotskyists. Syndicalists of various persuasions. Republican liberals and downright fascists. The sky would be the limit. Now, is this solely because Spain is a Catholic nation, nourished by the strongly libertarian aspects of Catholic theology,
The political term liberal, after all, is of Spanish origin, imported to England by Southey in Scotland. Or is this variety of opinion behind the facade of an authoritarian regime the result, to use a term taken from our folklore, of the late Enlightenment, of Spain's backwardness? Of course, more than one factor has to be taken into consideration. But looking at Central and even Eastern Europe, only 50 years ago, a period which some of us still vividly remember, we will observe a far greater variety of opinions and also a much greater courage to utter them, to put them into print and to discuss them than it is evident right now. In Switzerland and in the democratic states, only the esprit fort dare to reject the democratic dogmas, but in the rest of Christendom, variety rather than uniformity was the keynote. No wonder, as the prevailing form of rule was mixed government, with the crown acting as a clasp, as a unifying factor. Ideological strife and divisions under such circumstances were uncomfortable but not fatal. The sometimes stormy elections and the even stormier sessions in the parliaments did not rend nations asunder. Then one could afford to have ideological differences. Conformity and excessive restraint, uniformity and the humble acceptance of official slogans had not become a civic duty and the order of the day. Not only social societal freedoms was much greater than it is today, and this although the differences between classes in the states were more marked, but even the political liberties were better protected. Let us, for argument's sake, imagine a street scene in Europe's relatively most absolutistic country, Russia, back in 1912. There across the square in St. Petersburg, we see a bearded man hurrying with a newspaper under his arm. Who is he? A member of the Imperial Duma. What political faction does he belong to? To the Bolshevik wing of the Social Democratic Party. What paper is he carrying? The Pravda. Where did he buy it? At the street corner. Aren't the poor Bolsheviks brutally persecuted by the almighty emperor? Well, in Imperial Russia, not a single communist had been executed as, since the days of Alexander II, only those making attempt against the life of the emperor or members of the imperial family were subjected to the death penalty. Unlike the anarchists, the communists did not believe in individual action. And to get a notion of life in jail under Nicholas II, we only have to read the memoirs of Trotsky. In viewing the ideological scene of the countries further west, we inevitably come to similar conclusions. Austria-Hungary, Germany, Belgium 50, nay, even 30 years ago, were brimming with ideological discussion based on opposing philosophies and theologies, a discussion today not entirely dead, but deprived of its dynamism, its conviction, its depth, its intellectual charm and magnificence. Qualities surviving today only in the very heart of the Orbis Catholicus. There the big trauma is less evident, the pressure from the East is less effective, and a disciplinarian community conformity spirit stemming from the Reformation faiths is nearly absent. The variety of live ideas in France has no counterpart in either Germany or Austria. We could imagine, for instance, we could not imagine a poster as that of the Soudet paint manufacturing company a few years ago in the French subway, where you saw 4 large Mariannes and the 5th one just looking coyly around the corner, and there it said, "The republics come and go, but the Soudet paints stay forever." The tierische Ernst would have prevented anything of the sort here in our center. After this inventory, we must come to the sad conclusion that in the Free West, by and large, the will to discuss basic political questions, metapolitics, political philosophy and theory, except behind closed doors among theologians, is at a new low point. Max Weber has reminded us that the great plains of Russia and the United States, die zum Schematismus neigen, the tendency towards schematic thinking, have no innate leaning towards freedom. Thomas Jefferson told us of America that this country, which has given to the world the example of physical liberty, owes to it that of a moral emancipation also. For as yet, it is but nominal with us. The inquisition of public opinion overwhelms in practice the freedom asserted by the law in theory. These are bitter words indeed. And actually, if you make a survey of American publishing and you look at the fate of nonconformist book as handled by the American press, we can go here from Walter Lippmann's Public Philosophy down to Felix Somaris' Krise und Zukunft der Demokratie, which is called Democracy Bay, which received 5 lines, so published by a reputable big publishing house. Then you understand what I mean. Obviously, one can treat this mounting tide of conformity as part and parcel of a waning courage of conviction in all domains of thought and feeling. We encounter this phenomenon today even in the Catholic Church, where only 10 years ago a pope, a unique event in church history, felt that he had to exhort the faithful to speak up on matters which are not dogmatically settled. He reminded a group of assembled Catholic journalists that without a live opinion, the church would be in a sad condition, and that the members of the press would be amiss in their duty, not only if they indulged in destructive criticism, but also if they persevered in a servilisme muet, in a dumb servility. And of course, where's today the Catholic painter who paints a fresco in a church at the western entrance and shows popes and bishops and emperors, or presidents, of course, bank presidents going to hell. But that's all. We're living in the modern age. Now, you see here, the problem is we see here, one could argue that the present situation in traumatic Europe is the lesser of two evils. Seemingly the specter, especially in Central Europe, of another 1932-1933 is not hanging over this usually so seismic area. Yet first of all, I do not trust this sort of stability. Democracy here is not a solid dogma. Its roots have hardly penetrated the surface. Its various scientifically unprovable tenets taken separately are not really believed. Actually, a tremendous vacuum exists in Western Europe, and especially so in the German-speaking areas. Too many among us want to disregard the danger signals. This escapist expect that modern youth will persevere in its present stage of anti-intellectual Epicureanism and nihilism, which is a vain hope, if a hope it is. As a matter of fact, the younger ones among the young no longer share the memory of the misuse of their parents' idealism, and we have to doubt strongly that they will forever content themselves with the repetition of official formulas and cliches. At the same time, we have no guarantees that the ideas and notions the growing generation might adopt will be truly liberal. 15 years have elapsed since the new restoration, and we should not forget that from the July Revolution back to Waterloo, exactly also 15 years, half a generation have elapsed, and then things started moving. There is moreover, in face of the danger from the East, a real and urgent necessity to view and to review our political problems from the vantage point of personal liberty, no less than that of material and moral preparedness. And above all, I would say of intellectual preparedness. Yet such intellectual preparedness is possible only within a free exchange of thought and going down to truly to the roots, take up the political problems, ask the monumental questions whether our political institutions, from the Iron Curtain to San Francisco, whether they are really and truly ideally fitted for the two roles of the survival of freedom in these countries, and also, on the other hand, to stem materially and practically, and militarily if you like, the onslaught from the East. But this, of course, the Socratic dialogue is by no means a postulate of the masses, who think in the terms rather of emotions and the satisfaction of their material needs. In the realm of the intellect and spirit, however, new insights, new cognitions, and, let us use the hackneyed expression, real progress can only be achieved by the interchange of ideas, well reflected, manly spoken, earnestly listened to, carefully weighed, rejected, modified, or accepted. I thank you for paying attention to me for a lecture
which only raises dilemmas but not a single practical solution.
Very much, very interesting talk. Our next speaker is Professor David McCord, Wright, McGill University, Canada.
I'm greatly impressed by the comments on Spanish liberalism. I remember being impressed by Spanish liberalism before. I got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to interview labor leaders' attitudes toward modernization all over Europe. And when I got to Madrid, the labor attaché told me there weren't any labor unions in Spain because they were not permitted. So I remember profoundly the variety of Spanish liberalism. Now, I'd like to add one short footnote to Dr. Röpke's historical references to Kassel. And that is that among the French refugees here, with Marie-Elise Courtin, the direct ancestors of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. And I think it is nice that those doughty fighters for freedom, as they were and are, should be connected with this place too. We mustn't forget the European roots of the United States. Now, going on to the point, I will assume that you read my paper, if only because it's so short that it wouldn't have been much trouble. Now I would like to put in the point of it, which I left out, and that is my specific criticisms of American propaganda and why. I think myself that I've been saying this in public with no effect for about 5-6 years now. We're largely wasting our efforts, the United States, in the propaganda line because we're unwilling to come to grips with the basic facts. We talk a lot of talk about freedom and the American standard of living. Now the Russians are trying to do their best to debunk the American standard of living. But what we do not realize, or I don't know how much instruction this audience needs, but what the people running a great deal of American propaganda do need to realize is that the Russians can very easily counter the talk about freedom once they get a sucker to listen to him. Because, as you all know, the whole communist setup is in the two-stage phase. That in the preliminary phase, in which they now claim to be, anything goes and any oppression is justified because someday they will be in the stage of true communism and true freedom. And consequently, they can always say, well, this is tough now, but I must be cruel to be kind. Now, if we are going to make a real impression on the intellectuals of the world who are largely the center from which much of this agitation springs, communist agitation springs, we must go further. And we must explain why the state cannot wither away, never can wither away. Until we do that, we are not getting anywhere. Now but why don't we? Why don't we go on and explain why the state can't wither away? Well, in order to do that, we would have to attack the communist doctrine of the class struggle. That is the bourgeois proletariat two-stage struggle. And if we do that, we find ourselves stressing the inevitability of conflicts of interest among pressure groups and the need for some reconciliation between them by some mechanism. In other words, and we have to show that the rising standard of living inevitably implies certain conflicts because some people are inconvenienced by the rising standard of living. All right. Now, if we do that, then we begin to debunk the cry for security, particularly job security, which is very popular with labor leaders. Consequently, anybody who begins to make a real attack on the theory of the class struggle soon finds himself embroiled with those vested interests which want security at all costs. Now again, suppose we begin to talk about the surplus value, the theory that all profits is exploitation. Instantly, we come into collision with the people who maintain that there is no need for incentive. And some very, 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 very respectable organizations in the United States have published so-called scientific proof that businessmen need no incentive, that they work for pure law, which in my opinion is pure hokum, but that's as may be. Oh, if you talk about that, then you run into the problem of the need for incentive, and then you find yourself, if you talk about incentive, then you find yourself involved in the need for inequality of treatment. You find yourself involved in having to say that the man who does a good job should be given a better reward. And so instantly you collide with the pressure toward equalitarianism. One finds today so many people who say, yes, I favor the market system, but I don't like any unequal results which it produces. And I would like to eliminate them by taxation, leaving the market framework to run. Now, frankly, I cannot buy that, because the motive of the market framework is the pushes and pulls of the profit system. And if you tax away differential profits and rewards, you tax away the motive power of a system. But again, we can't talk about the need, we can't attack the doctrine of surplus value without stressing incentive and reward and inequality, and that doesn't suit a lot of people either. So again, down one on that. But another aspect that we run into, it's not all on the left that the opposition comes. If you believe in free society and generally the libertarian approach which we have taken, you have to stress the importance of the individual, his role as an innovator, that the great ideals of the world may be hatched out in cooperation, but still there are certain qualities of personality that cannot be avoided. That without people, individual people of insight, and special treatment for individual people of insight, there cannot be real development or real cultural achievement. And there one comes up against the smooth corporativism of the big business only group. Let me say that again, the big business only group. I get libeled by both sides. One side would have me an all-out pure competitor, and the other side would have me an all-out big businessman, whereas I'm simply interested in a society which is fluid enough for little businesses to have a chance to become big and big businesses to have a chance to go boom. In other words, passage up, passage down. All right. But there is a very strong group. I speak feelingly on this because I ran into it at an Institute of Public Relations specialist in Wisconsin about 2 months ago. A very strong group within corporate management, fortunately a minority, but still very influential, who are interested in selling the big business only approach, favoring a smooth, unchanging system run by computers and no change either. And they don't like the stress on competition and on change and development and the role of the individual. it is considered to be the last word, that committees do everything. The individual doesn't matter. Just bring together in the proper organizational framework the right number of people and everything will be all right. I have a little pamphlet outside called The Administrative Fallacy, which is talking about that. Well, you see, that's the sort of thing one is up against. If one undertakes to present the intellectual case for capitalism against the communists, the fire comes from the back as well as in the front, because it becomes impossible to present the thing without stepping on so many toes that we relapse back into the travel folder level of propaganda. Now, this is a very serious affair, because we are up against a people who are just as psychologically trained as we are, but they are also willing to use the appearance of rational argument. Not really, but the appearance of rational argument. And that is what we are not doing. We are not appearing to be the rational argument. Now, my time seems to be shortened on me by 5 minutes, so if you don't mind, I will get the end of it. When I published something to this effect in the Harvard Business Review not long ago, the editor put a satirical little footnote. Tell the world about the wonderful inequalities at home. That was the only comment. Professor Wright says, tell the world about the wonderful inequalities at home. Well, now, damn it, that's just what we should be doing. Without a stress of the why of inequality and the reasons for it. Talk about equality of opportunity or fair chance or something like that. But the working of our system does depend on incentive within a framework of fluid inequality, and if we are afraid to say it, we're shot.
Next speaker is Mr. Reig from Madrid. I'm afraid that we shall have to postpone the last speech until this afternoon.
No, don't be afraid. I think I'll manage in 10 minutes. Just read a bit. And so our good friend Navarro will be able to speak, and you won't have to be giving me such a long time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you well know, for the science economics, its unique and peculiar position is the fact that its theorems cannot be brought to any verification or falsification on the ground of experience. Sound economic policies, as Professor Mises taught us, of course, bring about the effects desired, and faulty economic policies do not bring about the effects we were looking for. But all this is historical experience. That is to say, the experience of complex phenomena. And because complex phenomena can never prove nor disprove any particular theorem, because we are never in a position in a certain historical event to observe the change of one element only, all the other elements being unchanged. This makes that all historical experience may be interpreted in the most different ways, and we have the experience of the German economic recovery that has been interpreted, as you all well know, in the most different and contradictory ways. Now, these unique and peculiar characteristics of our science has very grave consequences, for it prevents the man in the street from recognizing the reality of what economics teaches us. And yet, only if the man in the street, only if the common man and the masses perceive the reality of what economics teaches us, can these discoveries be applied and be fully used by society. Social, and this is, I would like to assure you, quite true, not in a democracy, but just as well in any type of dictatorship. Social progress, as Professor Mises has told us once and again, depends on two factors, and you will know. On the one hand, the intellectual power of outstanding men to discover the true and the sound economical realities. And on the other hand, the ability of these men or other men to make those ideologies palatable to the majority of the people. The old liberals, I use the word liberal in the European sense, of course, blithely assumed that all that was reasonable would carry on just on its reasonableness. They never gave a thought to the possibility that the majority might espouse and might follow ideologies that would bring great harm on welfare and well-being of the people. These pioneers of capitalism rightly never gave, they didn't think it was possible for the intelligent man to go so wrong as he had gone. After having nullified the fable of the divine mission of anointed kings, they fell into other ideas just as wrong. They began believing fervently in the irresistible power of reason. They thought and they believed in the infallibility of what they call the volonté générale, and they believed firmly in the divine inspiration of majorities. But now the majorities precisely did just the contrary to what these liberals thought. They were easy praise to Marxian doctrines and to the interventionist and socialist doctrines of other authors. These teachings, as we all well know, brought on us wars and sorrows we have all known. These wars and these sorrows, Europe and the civilized countries would never have had to suffer them had they been more enlightened in their economic policies. And this trend towards socialism and interventionism will, I'm sure, destroy our society unless we stop it in time. But such an ominous trend can be stopped. Our situation today is completely different from what it was 100 years ago, when socialism conquered the intellectuals and conquered the leaders of the masses. There were then decisive economic problems that had not yet been mastered. But today, we can scientifically prove that the market economy, capitalism, let's say it straight, capitalism is the social system that can give more to all. We have outstanding economists who have taught us and have proved to us, first, that socialism must necessarily impoverish the people that suffer it, contrary to what the majority thinks. Second, that all interventionist policies, all varieties of interference with the market phenomena, not only fail to achieve those ends that were desired, but bring about a situation that is worse still, in the valuations of the interventionists, of course, than the situation that we wanted to change. And thirdly, we also know that while laissez-faire eliminates, I couldn't find the word, sorry, eliminates the causes of international conflict, government interference with business, and socialism create conflicts for which there is no possible peaceful solution. What today generates war, let me use the words of my admired Professor Mises, is the economic philosophy almost universally espoused by governments and political parties. We thus come to a conclusion stated by Professors Röpke and Rüstow. Great economic sacrifices would justify, they say, the attainment of justice and liberty. Such sacrifices, however, are not necessary, are the same economic system, let me read this to you, which safeguards these two values, justice and liberty, is strangely enough also the most productive of all economic systems known to us. The competitive market thus provides justice and liberty on the one hand, and the highest economic benefit on the other. If the intellectual leaders of the working classes are capable of leaving aside today their present demagogy and of conveying the above mentioned facts to the masses, there will be peace and abundance for all. If, on the contrary, the people insist in destroying the market economy, then we are all, the workers first of all, doomed. For in the future we shall only have war, servitude, and famine. That's all.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Navarro, I think, needs 20 minutes. I think, therefore, it will be better to have that speech in the afternoon. Is that agreeable to you? Then the meeting is adjourned.
Ich habe mich eher so angestellt. Sie haben gesehen, ich bin gesprungen, dass ich nur 21 Minuten.